Assalamu alaikum. Good day. Um, I'd like to do a. I'm liking doing a video on the Bo-Kaap, and the title of it is Bo-Kaap Misrepresented. Now, at the back of me, you see a combo of the Bo-Kaap, a painting that I did that basically gives a kind of a colorful presentation of Bo-Kaap. Some of the houses are colorful, and these are only some of the houses in Bo-Kaap that are colorful. The rest of the houses are not as colorful as it is. And in my article that I actually will be reading for you from my blog, which is called Bo-Kaap Helper, and it's called Bo-Kaap Misrepresented. I basically present a kind of a truth of the Bo-Kaap history, which is not being presented by your conventional colonial story that is being told to tour guides, etc., to teach other people. And that's how who misrepresents Bo-Kaap. Primarily, it's a colonial narrative, it's a colonial story. Why did they have this kind of Bo-Kaap being the slaves that have been emancipated slaves, and they have got these stories about we Bo-Kaap people being the descendants of slaves. So why would they do this kind of thing? Um, because primarily Bo-Kaap is really not the descendants of slaves, and there are actually proofs of that from the academic records. But the story has been told so often that people tend to believe it. So why would the colonials do this? The reason why they try to present the Bo-Kaap as the descendants of slaves, and the big question would be, why would the Bo-Kaap people be the descendants of slaves? What about the black people and the Boers who were taken as slaves by the British? And they don't seem to have any particular no preference or where the origin of the black people are as slaves. In actual fact, Mbeki at some particular point in time, one of the leaders said that he still has the blood of of the Malay slaves in him. So why would they try to send this message into people about the Burqas being the descendants of slaves? Well, the reason is the aim is to reduce the value of Islam as the spirit of strength and freedom in the Burqa. Now, how do they do this? They by degrading faith as part of culture. They try to say that faith is part of culture. And the method is creating a narrative of a colorful Bo-Kaap. That colorful Bo-Kaap, and the main intention of that kind of perception is that the intention here is that the people of Bo-Kaap are descendants of the colorful coons. And a community with no real roots, but descendants of slaves. And what is the intended impact of that? The intended impact is the disrespect for the value of the people of Bo-Kaap and the value of Islam. Now, the function of this misrepresentative narrative, the function of that is to attract European tourists to see a living museum, like the people of Bo-Kaap are like the descendants of slaves, and this is like a living museum who were colonized by the Dutch and the British, and who today need them to survive. This is what they basically try to tell people. What is the effect of this on the people and their property? They are flooded by strangers, tourists on a daily basis, not on a daily basis, but on an hourly basis. And the privacy and property is disrespected. People walk onto their stoops and have pictures taken without even respecting the people's rights. Why? Because it was the only city, and so why? What is the reality? Or what is the reality? Bo-Kaap was actually the bastion against apartheid. It's the only place they couldn't change into whites only. They tried, but they couldn't change it. Somewhere along the line, the mosques was in their way. Now, why? Uh, because it was the only city center that withstood the government's attempts to declare it white. How did they try to do that? There were 3 attempts by the city council to build a bridge through Bo-Kaap from the Durban Drive into Sea Point. Like they did in District 6, they first put a bridge through District 6 and then declared the one part white and the other part could stay black, the bottom part, which is not so significant to them. but in real terms, it never developed into anything. In actual fact, they wanted to make the District 6 an example of the success of apartheid, and unfortunately, it became the icon for the failure of apartheid because it could never really develop. Now, how was it thwarted? They were thwarted. The three attempts to build a bridge connecting the Vaal Drive to Sea Point through Bo-Kaap was dislodged by different mosques in the way of building the bridge. And every time they replan it, there's another mosque in the way. So there's about 10 mosques in the Bo-Kaap. Then after that, they abandoned it. That was in the 70s. And then they started the bridge on the edge of Bo-Kaap, which is the waterfront at the moment. And somewhere along the line, even that went haywire. The engineers failed to actually bring the features together. Funds were withdrawn, and so you have this incomplete bridge at the edge of Bo-Kaap, which is now the incomplete bridge that leads you to just around the corner. There you get to the waterfront. Now, why was why are the Bo-Kaap in actual fact such an attractive feature for people? Primarily, it's because of the faith of Islam, the spiritual presence that is in the Bo-Kaap, uh, and the 10 mosques that dotted through the whole area, which actually serves as a protection for the area. And there are spiritual luminaries that are buried along at the top of Bo-Kaap and so on by the grace of God. There were people who came from other countries who came to settle here who were actually spiritual luminaries. So why a tourist attraction to the Bo-Kaap? Um, the people, in actual fact, whatever narrative they tell about the Bo-Kaap, people naturally, because they are created by the Creator, they naturally are protected. They are protected. Uh, they are protected to the spirituality of the Bo-Kaap that exists there, and so their natural self are actually there's an inner heart yearning to see and to recognize the original spirit of divinity that they know about in the original existence when God said, be and it is. All of us spiritually existed in heaven. And so they are being attracted to that original kind of contract that we all made to believe in God and to submit to Him. And that's the natural attraction that people have. It's not so much the houses and they just want to be in that space where Muslims are actually an example of or a reminder of how they should be. So this is the kind of attraction that happens. So the other features are, so what is the history of the Bo-Kaap in real terms? The people are not the descendants of slaves, but they are actually the emancipators of slaves. They actually freed the slaves in giving them an opportunity to become Muslim. How is that done? Okay, the slaves find a spiritual presence in Bo-Kaap because Tuan Guru started the first public school in Owal Mosque, and that was like about 700 students that were taught about Islam and the Quran. And also, as people became Muslim, like some of the Dutch became Muslim, the British became Muslim, they started helping Tuan Guru to teach accounting and maths, etc. So it was like the first public school internationally, one can put it that way, because most of the echelons, higher echelons of the British were taught privately by private tutors. They didn't have public schooling because public schooling was not, people didn't, the British did not support the education of people who are not white because they were used basically to do the labor and keep them basically uneducated. So the slaves had a problem in living. The Dutch had this kind the slaves, mostly African slaves from Mozambique, etc., that they had imported, the black slaves. Um, and so the first people that actually came of Muslims that came to Cape Town were the Mardekas, which actually means people that are free, and they were the craftsmen that came with Van Riebeeck to actually build the Bo-Kaap as craftsmen. Now you can understand the slaves were used for the hard labor, and the craftsmen who are the Muslims from the different parts of the world, they were in actual fact the craftsmen that were paid a salary. They were paid a particular wage for the craftsmanship, whether they were dressmakers or builders, etc., so that they may do the work. And you cannot force people like that who are craftsmen to do such qualitative work which Bo-Kaap was built with. So they used to pay those people a salary. And there's 100 years from 1652 until 1806 when the British took over. The Dutch really didn't keep so much records, or like the British tried to create records. So that 100 years, more or less, that is enough time for the Muslims to develop a complete community in the Bo-Kaap as free people. And you can also see the freedom of Muslims in the artwork. You'll find the black slaves in chains, and you will find the Muslims walking around with their hats and their turbans as free people. So the artwork also shows you that the Muslims basically were not originally slaves. Um, so the 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 people are not descendants of the slaves, but the emancipators, the descendants of the emancipators of the slaves, because they provided the slaves with support in many ways. Um, Tuanguru started the first public school, which allowed people to actually come and spend time in the mosque. So the free slaves, or the free time the slaves had, they would spend with the Muslims in the Bo-Kaap, who welcomed them in the mosques and in the schools and in the homes for spiritual occasions, and offered them the opportunity to even marry amongst themselves. They would marry because later on you'll see in the proofs that slaves were not allowed to marry. They were allowed to have sex and have children. Children were property of the slave masters, and but they could not, in actual fact, marry. There are other reasons why I point out that the Muslims couldn't have been slaves, but rather the craftsmen, which is proof from history, which I'm going to show later on. So they welcomed the people in the mosques to come and learn, the children as well, and they allowed them to marry. They became Muslim and they married as Muslims, some of the slaves. And these are the African slaves that were used by the British. And because at the Dutch at that time didn't allow them to marry, and they couldn't. They were forced to become Christian or support and be in the back of the Christian church in the slave quarters. As they became Muslim, the black slaves started not going to church anymore, and the slave quarters became empty because they were now Muslims. Um, it was difficult for the Dutch to make the Muslims slaves because the slaves, Muslims would actually fight them, and it would be like a kind of a jihad, and they would actually kill the slave masters. So they were very fearful of the Muslims. So when the Dutch allowed the Muslims to come with them as the Mardekas, they allowed them freedom of religion. They allowed them to believe and be Muslims, but they didn't allow them to publicly have uh, the salah in public. So they had the salah in the rooms in Payne Street. There was a room in which the Muslims used to salah, but they didn't stop them from being Muslims. The other proofs will come later on to prove that the Muslims of Bo-Kaap were actually not the slaves, the descendants of slaves, but the descendants of the political prisoners that were here, the people that came freely as craftsmen, and people who actually came to South Africa or to Cape Town as business people. So um, the Muslims in Bo-Kaap gave the slaves honor in terms of the fact that it could come and be with him. And this was so the slave quarters in the Dutch Reformed Church became empty because the African slaves became Muslims now. Now, these were not the people of Bo-Kaap itself. They were people who came into Bo-Kaap. Now, we are the proofs. By the 1820s, about 370 to 491 free and slave blacks were taught Islam by Malay priests in their homes. So there's a statement there. In Beer, Shell, and Ajam's research, they point out that 370 free and slave blacks were taught Islam by the Malay priests in Bo-Kaap. So there's a distinct difference between the black slaves and the Malays and the Muslims. And there's a placard that the Dutch government actually did the following, in which they presented in their placard the following. A, the slaves could not keep their family names. Now, the Muslims of Bo-Kaap still have their original family names, such as Arifdin, Slamdin, etc. And Deen means religion. So you have many people that still have their original names and surnames, original surnames, which was not allowed to have, the slaves were not allowed to have. But what happens is some of the guides would come into Bo-Kaap and say that the slaves were not given or allowed to have these surnames, and so their surnames was October and November, December. Now these people with those surnames don't stay in Bo-Kaap. They stay in the platteland, basically, at the moment. So those are the people who are so-called the colored people, who are not Muslims, that actually have those surnames. They are actually the original people of the Cape, which basically you would say are the Khoi people. They were, in actual fact, mostly under the slave and control in the farmlands. So their surnames were changed, and other slaves were given other names. Now, the slaves were not allowed to marry, but they were allowed to have sex and have children, and became the owner, the property of the slave owners. Whereas the Muslims always married, and they had marriage ceremonies from the beginning already. A very powerful culture of Islam in Bo-Kaap with mosques, etc. And then one must also remember that the first mosque was given and started in 1794. Now, 1794, slave culture was still heavy in Cape Town, in South Africa, and in the world. And yet the Muslims had their first mosque in 1794. Now, that is actually the Oval Mosque in Dorp Street, and one can still see the placard there, or the plaque there, or the piece was in the building. So that is another indication that the Muslims couldn't have been the slaves because they had freedom of religion. Slaves did not have freedom of religion. Now, the slaves had to follow the faith of the owner. Now, the Muslims were originally Muslims from the beginning. They never conceded to becoming Christian, etc. And they always had their faith, and it was respected by the actual Dutch. They respected. They actually told people not to disturb their faith, and I think I've got it in my research here. So the slaves had to follow the faith of the owner, while the Muslims were always free and kept their religion in the Bo-Kaap. They established the first public school and mosque in South Africa in 1794, the Oval Mosque in Dorp Street. So slavery was only abolished by the British in 1836. Slaves could not own property, and that was a very important point. Bo-Kaap is all property owners. They became property owners because of their craftsmanship and the pay that they got, and they were good businessmen. So they became property owners. These particular houses in Bo-Kaap are all from descendants of people who were owners of property. So the Bo-Kaap people own the houses in Bo-Kaap for generations, and now they're selling these houses to people at very high prices because they're too old, some of them, and their families are all moved, so they sell their houses. So that fact that they were property owners is also a very great proof of the fact that Bo-Kaap people were not slaves because they did not um, their own property. Now, a Muslim does not. Now, it was difficult to get Muslims to become slaves because they would not submit to enslavement by any human being, and hence they would fight and die for their faith. And it's still a kind of a strong feature of the faith, and that is to fight jihad. And even if you do it alone, you get the reward of freeing people from oppression. Now, the Dutch and the British thus feared Muslims and would rather employ them as craftsmen and craftswomen, but not as slaves. And some black slaves that became Muslim killed their abusive owners, oppressive owners, to free all the other slaves. So you can see there, and that is in the work of Lady Barnard. They actually talk about the black Muslim running amok, where they actually kill the owners. So you can imagine the British and the Dutch were scared of having a Muslim slave because you cannot suppress him. He's going to kill you because he believes that he's fighting for his faith and freeing people. And he believes he's going to go to heaven for that. So the emptying of the slave quarters in the churches and the increased slaves amongst becoming Muslim prompted the government, to start actually Christian missionary schools because they became fearful that the blacks are becoming Muslims and the slaves are becoming Muslims, and they are not actually getting them to become Christian. And the Muslims had their first school already, and there was no public schooling yet amongst the Christians. So they decide, amongst the rulers, so the rulers decide, look, we need to do something. So Lord Charles Somerset promulgated in 1823 to compel Christian slave owners to send their slave children to Christian missionary schools after Lord Caledon's complaint in 1807 that imported Mozambican slaves were becoming Muslim. In Ajam's thesis in 1986, he wrote a thesis there. And so you can see that the particular point of Mozambican slaves that were becoming Muslim under the guidance of the imams, the Malay imams in Bo-Kaap. So you can see then that Bo-Kaap's people were actually the emancipators of slaves through their faith, through Islam, which is the heritage of Islam. Is the heritage of Bo-Kaap is actually Islam. And then after that, you can talk about the buildings, etc., which is the oldest buildings in the city, or the smallest compact place where you have different kinds of architecture: the British, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Arabian. All is a mixed architecture that is actually in Bo-Kaap. So the first recorded arrival of free Muslims, known as Mardukas, is in 1658. The Mardukas, or Mardukas is the way they spell it, implies freedom. It means freedom. The Mardukas were people from Amboya and Amboina, which is an Indonesian island, and you can see we look very much Indonesian, in the southern Moluccas, and were brought to the Cape in order to defend the newly established settlement. So they were also soldiers against the indigenous people, which is like the people who were like the Khoi, original Khoi. So they were also employed as members of the army, and also to provide labor and craftsmanship in the same way that they were employed at home. So at home they were also employed by the Dutch as craftsmen, or craftsmen within their own countries. And first by the Portuguese. The Portuguese brought them in first, later the Dutch, because the Portuguese did the voyages of discovery, and they brought Muslim slaves with as well. Not slaves, but the craftsmen as well. And they settled here as well. So you can see there's evidence of that as well. So Jan van Riebeeck had requested the Mardukas to be sent to the Cape. So there's records of that as a labor force, not as a slave force, as a labor force to be paid. The Mardukas were prohibited. This is a very important feature. The Mardukas were actually prohibited from openly practicing the religion of Islam, but they were not stopped from doing it. Like the slaves were stopped from being. They were They were taken, all their identity was taken away, children were removed from parents, etc. And the names were changed, and the surnames were changed, and the religion was supposed to be Christian. So this was in accordance with the Statute of India, drafted by Van Diemen in 1642. So they applied that particular Dutch particular law, which stated in one of its placards, statutes, no one shall trouble the Amboinese, which is the Muslims, about their religion or annoy them, so long as they do not practice in public or venture to propagate it amongst the Christians or the heathens. And they even made this particular law that offenders who actually hassle the Muslims, right, will be punished with death. But should there be amongst them, the Muslims, who are drawn to Christianity, drawn to God and become Christians, they were not to be prevented from joining the Christian churches. Now you see the same, just a very, very important statute here of the Dutch. You can see the fear that they had for the Muslims. That they even said that anybody disturbs the Muslims in being free to be Muslims, they will actually sentence the people to death. I mean, that is a very, very interesting feature. So one questions the British colonial kind of history that they wrote, that the Muslims were descendants of slaves in the Bo-Kaap. So the governor, John Mayat Saker, probably in anticipation of the advent of the Mardykas in the Cape of Good Hope, he reissued that placard in 1652, 1657, before the Mardykas arrived. So the placard governed the Cape as part of the Dutch colonial empire. The Muslims of Bo-Kaap are also descendants of influential political exiles, such as Tuanguru, who fought the Dutch and who were too dangerous to be jailed in their own country, so they were actually exiled. Some of them with their followers, such as Sheikh Yusuf. So you can see there's an enormous amount of fear for Muslims and for Islam. This explains the strength that's still inherent in Bo-Kaap Muslims to stand up against oppression, like for instance now the sale of property to outsiders instead of people, Muslims, to start building their own house, for Muslims to build houses for the Muslims who don't have houses, and they're selling it, the council is selling it to outsiders for millions and letting outsiders come in and build in the Bo-Kaap. So you see this fight here now, which has now been, it's the political feature now, and the mayor has just promulgated now that they are declaring Bo-Kaap an heritage overlay, which means you cannot build there anymore. Everything has to stop. And the ANC youth movement has now applied to the Heritage Council to investigate the heritage potential of Bo-Kaap. Now you see, it was always a possibility, but the council is stopping it because they're busy dealing with property. So now it's being forced because a few Muslims are actually taking it now to the streets in terms of protests, and because it's a vast international tourist attraction, they now don't want to let the world know that they are doing that kind of oppression still, of denying people proper housing, etc., etc. And then also the spiritual assistance that was given, that the crane couldn't even move up a normal road, and it is supposed to go up to any terrain with those tires. But you see that the angels kept them from actually moving. And that was a sign to the Muslims that even though they are few, they are being supported by spiritual powers. And also, it sends a message to the non-Muslim or to the oppressor that don't try to mess with the Muslims in Bo-Kaap, because they are strengthened by the angels. So, the fact of the colorful houses, and they always try to give this story that there's the story on the red bus that says the Muslims were so happy that that they were freed as slaves that they painted their houses different colors. The color technology was never even available in the time. It was, it was chalk that was used to paint the houses. So you can see the stupidity of that kind of narrative. And color technology by Plascon only came in 1999 to the year 2000 when bright colors came in. And therefore, the Red Bus Tour claimed that Bo-Kaap people were so happy to be free that they painted their houses different colors is not only derogatory, but it is blatant ignorance of modern life and of history. So there was only white chalk paint in those particular times. Hence the beautiful white old Dutch houses that was there. The colors only came afterwards. And only a certain section of Bo-Kaap has got colors, which is Kapini Street and Upwell Street. Furthermore, you won't find any much colors. It will normally your grey and your white houses, etc. But if they can tell the story, it looks like an exciting story for tourists, but it's not the truth. So I hope I've been able to assist you to see the beauty of Bo-Kaap, the spirituality of Bo-Kaap, and and that you will respect the people and the faith that is here, um, that is around, especially the people who go to mosque 5 times a day. You know, don't disrespect them. And I think as tourists, you will benefit much if you have those things in mind and you spread this video wherever you can before you arrive. And there are people that are the reason why the Muslims in Bo-Kaap don't stop the tourists from coming, even though it's discomforting. It's discomforting to many of us. It's because we want people to hear the adhan. We want people to hear the call to pray. We want to hear to remind people of Islam so that maybe they can come back to the original faith that they had in heaven, which they had forgotten. And many people have become Muslim through the work of the people of Bo-Kaap. So all the best. I hope to do some more videos later, but for now, let's starting to change that kind of narrative to the truth of the people of the Bo-Kaap as the descendants of the craftsmen, the people who came to settle here for business, as well as the political prisoners and the teachers that came to stay here from different parts of the world to spread Islam. And so we are all descendants of these people. And I think the most powerful feature about this is our freedom of religion that we always had, which is not a characteristic of a slave, and the property that we own in the Bo-Kaap. It's all family owned. And the fact that we started our own school, the first international public school. So if you do come to Bo-Kaap as a tourist, welcome. And I hope we meet each other and you meet with good people, and hopefully some of you will become Muslim, inshallah, if you are not Muslim already, following your heart in terms of your desire to be amongst people who are spiritual. And thank you for the support so far, and for your understanding and for sending this video to others. Thank you very much. Peace be upon you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I hope it comes out well. Bye. Thank you.